Hi all, and welcome to, I guess, what is part 2 of the DIY intercooler video series. But this one, and I apologize for the clickbaity title, I kind of assume that that's what I'm going to end up doing. But I was kind of surprised what I found when I took this thing apart. You saw it in part 1. There was a good amount of corrosion inside the end caps. Well, the reason why I didn't even think about that when I was building the thing was I initially intended to use purely distilled water in the thing. That didn't really work out because the sheer amount of ice this thing would actually melt in a pass was kind of astronomical. It melts between 10 and 15 pounds in one high 9, low 10 second pass. So it's pulling a lot of heat out, and that's just impractical to do with chilled water. You really need to put ice in it, and of course you don't know what the ice is made from, and I found an awful lot of corrosion in these end caps. So let's back up for a second, and before we get into all this stuff on here, let's see why we're getting that corrosion. Well, there's a thing called the Galvanic series. So this is the Galvanic series, and it goes from most noble to the left to least noble to the right. And what does that mean? That means basically if you have two different metals in an electrolyte, one is going to end up as the cathode and one is going to end up as the anode. So you're basically creating a battery. And there is, in fact, a voltage difference depending where on the chart you go. So my intercooler, of course, was made from aluminum and copper primarily. So that means, let's find aluminum. Aluminum alloys fall here somewhere between negative 0.75, let's say, and -1, and copper is here at around tops off at -0.4. So that gives us a voltage differential of about half a volt. Now this, of course, this voltage differential is calculated based on seawater. So in salt water, brine, you would end up with this kind of, well, I guess seawater's not quite brine. You would end up with half a volt difference. So what happens is the anode, whatever's most anodic, is what actually ends up getting effectively dissolved or corroded. So since aluminum was more anodic or functioned as an anode to the copper in my intercooler, this thing started to corrode, and it started to corrode like crazy. Actually, the thing was in there for about 2 years, and I would consider it a heavy amount of corrosion. You saw it in the video before. Maybe I'll put a still in here of what it used to look like before I cleaned it up. And then after I cleaned it up, I decided, well, there's basically 2 easy ways to get rid of this kind of thing going on, and that's this sort of corrosion going on. And that would be either you seal the surfaces, or you put in a sacrificial anode. So something that is further over this way on this chart. That would be like magnesium is way down here. Zinc is more of an anode than aluminum is. So I decided to go with zinc, and I also decided to seal the surfaces. So this stuff was painted with this VHT epoxy paint. How much of it is epoxy? I don't know, because it's not a 2-step process, but I got some good personal recommendations from it, so I decided to give it a shot. It was easily attainable. This can is like 15 bucks. It's only good to 250 degrees. That really shouldn't be an issue because the water going through there will never hit that. So anyway, so that was the sealer that I used, and you can actually see, and by the way, I lapped this surface, which is why there's no paint here. Basically made sure all the paint was smoothed out, and I will be using a sealer on these surfaces, specifically this stuff, this Loctite 565, greatest stuff in the world. There's also a high temp version of it, but I don't think I really need it for this, and I happen to have this on hand, so that's most likely what I'm going to end up using. But anyway, if I shine this just right, you can probably see the amount of corrosion in there. It's a pretty tremendous amount of corrosion. Of course, it's kind of heavy, so there's a couple of runs, but it's inside the intercooler. Who cares, right? And you can probably also see how I lapped until I didn't have any pathways through in the paint, the shiny sections of the paint. And we did basically the same thing with this end cap. So this is the bottom section here. So this is the one that had the most corrosion, which you can probably see pretty well in there. And then I did one more thing. I went and I ordered a zinc anode. You can get these, I think I got these from boatzincs.com. No affiliation with them, it just happens to be where I found them. I wanted a 1/4 inch, well, not so much 1/4 inch, but a 1/8 NPT, because that's what I have room for in here. So this anode will screw into the bottom here. Let's see if I can do this on camera without embarrassing myself. Anyway, it screws in like that. It doesn't interfere with the flow. Since this is the bottom, this is the underside, it will simply sit in the water submerged all the time, and this will get eaten away as opposed to anything else. So let's go back to why does this apply to you, because I realize that most people do not have copper intercooler cores, although Whipple actually sells their high-end core is copper. Copper's got better heat transfer properties than aluminum, but it's more expensive, it's heavier. And of course it's has this issue which you need to take into account. But even so, even if everything in your system is just aluminum, you're going to end up in this spectrum here with aluminum alloys between -0.75, let's say, and -1 volt difference. So your water pump might very likely have a stainless steel shaft in it. So stainless steel is going to be over here, except for grades 410 and 416, but most stainless steel shafts will be right under -0.4, which also gives you about the same difference between aluminum and stainless as between aluminum and copper, like what I'm experiencing. So you will get corrosion. Now, in a street car, that's not really a big deal. You would run coolant in your heat exchanger circuit, but in a race car, that is a big deal, because you're not going to run coolant in there unless you have the presence of mind to drain it every time and fill it with coolant, and then you're dumping ethylene glycol all the time, and that has its own separate set of problems. You can get away with a much longer lifespan if you do put a sacrificial anode in the system someplace where it's exposed to the water, just like this. So that is one way to indefinitely extend the life of your intercooler. Aluminum cores tend to be much thinner walled, so they are more susceptible to this sort of thing. So keep that in mind. And they do actually spring leaks quite a bit. So aluminum, of course, is much harder to repair than this copper core is. You know, here I just reflow the solder, which is effectively what I did to fix that one little leak I had, and I cleared out the tubes and everything. So this thing is very serviceable, which is proving to be a good thing. But in an aluminum core, you have very thin walls. It's very hard to TIG it, especially if there's already corrosion taking place, because, of course, aluminum oxide is very difficult to TIG weld through. Put that on a thin surface and it's almost impossible. So this anode was like $6. It's definitely worth it, especially if I only have to replace this once every couple of years, let's say, which I'll keep track of, and we'll find out exactly what the interval is. But I think after learning what I did, I certainly am never going to go without some sort of sacrificial anode again. And in fact, I bought a larger one to put in the engine just because it's going to keep the water jackets in the heads and the intake manifold from corroding. So again, $6, cheap insurance. Get yourself a zinc anode if you have an air-to-water intercooler, especially if you're racing it. But even if you're not, even if you are running a standard heat exchanger setup, it's still worth doing because it's so cheap, it's so easy to do. So I encourage you strongly to give it a shot and give your intercooler core a chance at a long and happy life. So thanks for watching, and subscribe. More to come.